I built my first serious outdoor bench the way the magazines told me to. Thick timber, tight modern joinery, a good marine glue in every seam, and more stainless steel screws than I care to admit. It felt like a fortress the day I set it down in the garden, solid as stone. At least, that is what I thought. 2 winters later, the top had split along a glue line. One of those screws had quietly torn the grain around it, and the whole thing rocked like a loose tooth. I had built it to resist the weather, and the weather won. It took me years and a long look at boats far older than me to understand that the strongest thing I could have done was let it move. This is the trick the Vikings used to take slim wooden longships through storms that swallowed heavier, prouder ships whole. And once you see it, you will build differently for the rest of your life. Now, if you had handed a modern naval engineer a Viking longship and asked him to sail it into a gale, he might have laughed at you. These boats were thin, the oak planking on a ship like the Gokstad, the one they pulled from a burial mound in Norway and now keep in a great hall in Oslo, is in places barely as thick as your thumb. The hull is long and narrow and low to the water. By every instinct we are taught, that should be a coffin in a heavy sea. And here is the strange part. That very thinness, the thing that looks like weakness, was the whole secret. The longship did not survive the storm by being stiff and strong. It survived by being supple. It bent, it flexed, it moved with the water instead of fighting it, and that is a lesson the old builders knew in their hands long before anyone wrote it down. So let me show you how they built that supple hull, because the method has a name, and it is one you can borrow in your own shop. It is called clinker construction, sometimes called lapstrake, and the idea is beautifully simple. Instead of setting each plank edge to make one smooth skin, the Viking builder overlapped each plank over the top of the one below it, like the clapboards on the side of an old farmhouse, or like the shingles on a roof. Each of those long planks running the length of the boat is called a strake, and where one strake laps over the strake beneath it, that overlapping band is called the land. Hold on to that word. The land is where the magic lives. Along that land, the builder fastened the 2 planks together with iron rivets. He would drive the rivet through both planks, slip a little square iron washer over the pointed end on the inside, a washer the old shipwrights call a rove, and then peen the tip over with a hammer until it spread and locked tight against the rove. Rivet after rivet after rivet, a whole seam of them marching down the land of every strake. No glue, none, just iron, wood, and a man with a hammer and a good eye. Now here is a detail I walked right past for years myself, and it matters more than any of the rest. Those planks were not sawn, they were riven. Riving means splitting the log out along its own grain with wedges and a froe, following the natural lines of the wood rather than cutting straight across them. When you rive oak, instead of sawing it, every fiber runs unbroken from one end of the plank to the other. Nothing is cut through, and a plank whose grain runs unbroken end to end can bend and spring and carry a load without snapping, in a way a sawn plank never will. The old builders were not being primitive. They were being clever. They were choosing the strongest possible wood before they ever picked up a rivet. And there is a rhythm to building this way that you feel in your body once you have done it. The steady ring of the hammer peening one rivet after another down the land, the plank taking its curve under your hands, the way each new strake laps over the one below like a shingle, so the water runs down and off the outside of the hull, instead of finding a way in. Every lap is a small roof for the plank beneath it. Every rivet is a stitch in a seam that is meant to move. You are not assembling a rigid box. You are sewing a skin, and a skin is supposed to give. Put those 2 things together, and you get something remarkable. You get a hull that is not one rigid box, but a whole field of overlapping planks, each one riveted to its neighbor along the land, each one riven so its grain runs true. It is a shell made of many small, springy pieces, all holding hands. Push on it, and it does not crack. It gives. It shifts a little at every seam, spreads the load across 100 rivets, and then springs back. Think about that for a moment. A wall built to be rigid meets a great force by breaking somewhere. A hull built to flex meets that same force by moving everywhere at once, and moving is how it survives. I felt this the first time I put my hand on the planking of a sailing reconstruction down in Roskilde, in Denmark, where they build these ships the old way and actually take them to sea. Under load, you can watch the whole hull breathe. You can feel it come up through your palm, a slow give and return, like the flank of a big animal breathing in its sleep. The seams open a hair and close again with the swell. A modern boat builder would panic. The Viking builder expected it. He built the boat to do exactly that. And that breathing, that gentle working of the whole shell, is the thing that carried these ships through weather that had no business letting them live. If this way of building speaks to you, I gathered all of it in my book, Secrets of the Shipyard. It is where I show you how the old builders made a hull hold water without a single drop of glue, faying one plank to the next so tightly the sea never found its way in. You will find the book through the link in the description. So that is the shell. Overlapping strakes, riven oak, iron rivets, a hull that breathes. But the breathing hull is only half the answer. What that flex actually does in a storm is the part that made grown sailors trust their lives to a boat you could very nearly lift out of the water by hand. Picture a big, heavy, stiff-framed vessel taking a wave broadside. All that force hits a hull that refuses to move, and so the force has to go somewhere. It goes into the joints. It goes into the fastenings. It goes into cracking the very stiffness that was supposed to be strength. Every wave is a hammer blow, and a rigid hull takes each blow full on the chin. Do that for a long enough night in a bad enough sea, and something lets go. A seam opens. A frame breaks. Water comes in. Now put the longship in that same sea. The wave hits, and instead of standing rigid, the whole hull works. Working is the shipwright's word for the way a wooden hull flexes and shifts under load, the planks moving against each other just slightly, the whole structure giving and recovering like a living thing. The force of the wave does not slam into one stubborn point. It spreads out through every lapped seam and every rivet, softened and shared, and then the hull springs back to shape. It is the difference between catching a hard ball with a stiff arm and catching it with a soft, giving hand. The stiff arm bruises. The soft hand cradles the ball and lets the force bleed away. And the shape of the boat helps the flex do its work. A longship sits shallow in the water. Her draft, which simply means how deep the hull reaches below the surface, is very small. She carries very little weight for her size, so her displacement, the amount of water her hull pushes aside, is low. And she rides high, with plenty of freeboard, which is just the height of the side from the waterline up to the rail. Put all that together, and the longship does not sit down into the sea and let the waves bury her. She is light enough and buoyant enough to lift, to rise up over the face of a swell, rather than plow straight through it. A heavy hull digs in and takes the wave aboard. The light hull steps up and lets the wave pass beneath her. This is not a guess or a romantic story. The crews who sail the Roskilde reconstructions across open water have written down what they felt. They talk about the hull twisting under them in a seaway, the ship alive beneath their feet, the timbers working and complaining and holding. One of them described sailing home in rough weather and feeling the whole boat flex like a woven basket, and never once feeling that it would fail. That is the trust the old builders earned. One of those ships, a great reconstruction they named the Sea Stallion, was sailed all the way from Roskilde, over to Dublin and home again, across some of the roughest water in Northern Europe, and she came back whole. They did not fight the ocean. They built a boat that agreed with it. I want you to hold that image, because it is the whole point of everything I make now. The sea did not respect strength. It respected suppleness, and the boats that lived were not the proud, stiff ones. They were the ones humble enough to bend. But there is one more piece to this, and if you skip it, the whole thing falls apart, because a springy shell of planking is only free to flex if you do not nail it rigidly to a stiff skeleton inside. And here the oldest Viking builders did something that still amazes me. In the earliest ships, like the Oseberg and the Gokstad, they did not fasten the internal frames hard down to the planking at all. They left little raised lugs, called cleats, standing proud on the inside face of the planks when they carved them out, and then they lashed the frames to those cleats with spruce root and cord. Lashed, tied, not spiked, not glued, not locked solid. Think for a second about what that does. The frame holds the shape of the hull, gives it its ribs, but the lashing lets the planking move a little against the frame instead of being pinned to it. The skin can work, the skin can breathe. The frame guides it without imprisoning it. Later, builders used wooden pegs and tree nails, which are just pegs of dry oak driven through the wood to fasten it, swelling tight when they meet damp. But even then, the whole philosophy held. Fasten it firmly enough to hold, loosely enough to move. That balance is the entire art. I did not learn this from a book. I learned it in a heritage yard over in Essex, from an old shipwright with hands like oak roots, who watched me fussing over a joint one gray morning and told me to stop trying to make it perfect and start letting it live. He set a lapped, riveted seam beside me in about the time it takes to tell it, tapped it once with a knuckle, and said it would hold longer than you and me both. He has been gone a good few years now. That seam, as far as I know, is still holding. That is the kind of promise the old methods make, and unlike a fresh glue line, they tend to keep it. Now set that against how most of us were taught to build. We glue everything. We drive a hard stainless screw through two pieces of wood as if we are trying to punish them, and then we wonder why, a few seasons later, the wood has swelled and shrunk with the weather and split itself apart right at the fastening. The screw did not move. The glue did not move. So the wood, which is alive and always moving, had nowhere left to go but to tear. I learned that the hard way on that garden bench and on a dozen projects after it, before the boats finally taught me better. Wood is going to move. Your only real choice is whether you let it or whether you force it to break. Now, I would be lying to you if I said flex was the answer to everything, because it is not, and the Vikings themselves ran headlong into its limit. Here is the catch. Flex is a gift right up until a boat gets too big. A short, slim longship can twist and spring and recover all night long, but stretch that same flexing hull out longer and longer, and the very movement that saved the small boat starts to work it to pieces. Past a certain length, suppleness stops being strength and becomes weakness. The seams work too far, the hull racks and strains against itself. What flexed gracefully at 40 feet begins to tear itself apart at 100. And that is exactly why, as ships grew larger over the centuries, builders slowly turned away from clinker and toward a different method called carvel. In carvel construction, the planks are laid smooth, edge to edge, with no overlap, over a heavy rigid framework of thick sawn timbers, and the seams are packed watertight afterward. A carvel ship does not flex like a basket. It holds like a fortress, because at that size, it has to. If you have ever watched the great rebuild of the old sailing cutter Tally-Ho, where they craft massive grown frames and long scarfed planks, a scarf being a long tapered joint that splices two timbers into one continuous length, then you have seen carvel thinking in the flesh. Big, stiff, heavily framed, magnificent. A different answer to a different problem. So the old builders were not primitive and then suddenly enlightened. They were wise both times. For a small, fast raider, they chose flex. For a great ocean-crossing ship, they chose stiffness. They fit the method to the boat, and that, more than any single clever trick, is the real mark of a master. So, what does any of this mean for you, standing in your own shop, building a gate or a bench or a set of doors that you want still standing when your grandchildren are grown? It means you stop treating wood like dead material to be locked in place, and start treating it like the living, moving thing it truly is. Wood swells in the damp and shrinks in the dry. That is called movement, and it never stops, not for 100 years. Fight it with rigid glue and hard fasteners in the wrong places, and the wood will win the same way it won against my bench. Work with it, give it room to move. Choose joints that can breathe a little, and the same forces that would have destroyed your work will pass right through it and leave it whole. Follow the grain when you can, the way the old builders rove their planks. Fasten firmly enough to hold and loosely enough to move, the way they lashed their frames. Let the outdoor thing you build flex a hair with the seasons, instead of standing rigid until it cracks. Look at a well-made old tabletop sometime, and you will see the very same thinking. The end pieces, the breadboard ends, are pegged through slots that let the top swell and shrink underneath them without ever splitting. That is a lashed frame shrunk down to the size of your bench. The maker simply left the wood somewhere to go. None of this is complicated. It has simply been forgotten. That garden bench of mine is long gone, and I do not miss it. But I think about it every single time I set a joint now, because it taught me the very lesson the Longships had been teaching for 1,000 years. The strong thing breaks. The supple thing survives. Build the supple thing. Trust the wood. That book, Secrets of the Shipyard, carries the rest of it. The old ways of keeping wood alive with pitch and tallow and tar and linseed oil, and 3 full builds you can raise in your own shop. Scan the QR code on screen to bring it home. And if you want more of this, subscribe to the Master Shipwright, where we keep the ocean-tested craft that has lasted centuries.